In this lecture, we'll be taking a look at what is referred to as the synthetic approach toward applying criminal theory to everyday issues within the criminal justice system. To begin with, it is extremely important to consider whether or not a theoretical school of thought is inherently practical. To achieve this, one must look not only at the theory itself and its applications in a variety of contexts, both sociological and traditional, and also criminological, but one must also understand something about the history of that school of thought. What inspired it? What was the historical context for the initial proposal of that theoretical perspective? Why was it initially applied? And more importantly, was it historically a criminal concern? Ronald Akers and Christine Sellers provide us with a pretty good list to follow when we are considering whether or not a theoretical school of thought in a parent discipline like sociology is practical as it relates to the criminal justice system. They recognize really three considerations that need to be made. The first relates to the theory itself. What are the basic concepts and assumptions that underline this theoretical school of thought? What are potential variables, both dependent and independent? Has the theory itself been applied to an area of study that you, as the individual now applying this theoretical school of thought, fall within? The next piece falls kind of on this first consideration, but this directly relates to the idea of data-driven results. So when we have identified variables, when we have collected information relating to variables that change and variables that are environmental or circumstantial, these are more context or contextual in nature. Have we collected data, or has data been historically collected in each of these areas of potential data? Have these variables been identified? Have they been then tested? What are the kinds of tests that have been used? And these variables, are they in a sense valid options for an individual to collect and apply with regard to a particular criminological or deviant topic? And then the last consideration that is important is whether or not the theory itself provides a best explanation for what we are observing in the field. So when we are taking a look at juvenile delinquency, does peer socialization and social learning, how does that adequately explain the kinds of choices that we see young people in a variety of contexts making? And what are those contexts, right? What is the kind of social environment that the individuals are growing up within? Are there elements of social control that also are at play? And how do they interact with, in this case, peer socialization? So you have to kind of take all of these into consideration, see how they are working with one another, look at the studies that have applied them in a historically and traditional way, historically appropriate and traditional way, and then what are the outcomes of those studies themselves, and are those outcomes appropriate for finding important solutions with regard to public policy and, of course, the application of criminal law in our judicial system. Delbert Elliott's integrative model is a very good example of this propositional integrative approach in not only selecting specific kinds of models for not only criminological topics, but a wide variety of topics within modern sociology, but also a wonderful model for bringing together the strengths throughout the sociological world. In this case, bringing together not only models having to do with social strain, which again have historically remained applicable to a wide variety of topics in deviant behavior, but also taking a look at context and developing a hierarchy of additional variables that help us to better understand the role that environment plays in the social development of an individual and also in their decision-making skills. The integrative theory that Eliot provides takes into consideration a variety of topics in an ascending order. So it builds a hierarchy within these interrelated topics, and it begins with the topic of social strain. Where Eliot begins his model is in the area of social strain. He then brings us through the notion of social relationships and how we are developing those, and ultimately how strong those social bonds are. He takes us beyond this by also integrating how social bonds play an important role in peer socialization. And then he very closely examines how all of these, or I should say, this hierarchy of causality then results in a deviant act. Now, when you closely examine this hierarchy and this very integrative model that Eliot provides us with, you realize that there are two even larger schools of thought that he is connecting with as he attempts to understand both correlation and causality and behavior itself. And that is learning theory and social control theory. And so let's begin by connecting his ideas with learning theory and review a little bit of what learning theory provides. When we look at research that connects with learning theory, we realize that we are dealing with research that very much connects with the American School of Psychology and some of the psychological and biological theories that are important to criminological topics. There is an emphasis in learning theory that relates to really two things. First, learning theory looks at the kinds of models that exist within the minds of individuals, the kinds of things that we tap into as we make decisions. And then the kind of other side of that coin is the idea of motivation. So then what is driving our ultimate behaviors on a regular or habitual process? What we find is that, especially with juveniles, there is a wide range of socializing variables that are part of their environment. In our previous study of learning theory, we took a look at the power of media. That continues to grow. But the idea of an environmental determinant is extremely important when we're trying to understand something about learning theory. Now, in the 1970s, Albert Bandura was an important voice in applying, in this case, imitation and environment and environmental determination or determinism in a sense, to better understand why people chose to be aggressive or why people chose to restrain potentially aggressive behaviors. And his research was extremely important in really understanding how learning theory could connect to criminological topics. There are really four important components to Bandura's application of learning theory. He took a look at how, in terms of our daily lives, we were taught aggression when it was appropriate, how that aggression was to be, in a sense, expressed, um, and the benefits or the kind of problems with aggressive behavior. Another area, second area that Bandura's research connected us with regard to learning theory is the idea of restraint. The idea that there are environmental components that weaken our ability to hold back aggressive behavior. Third, he took a look at how things like the media, for example, began to desensitize us to aggressive acts. The idea of normalizing aggressive behavior was a very important third almost pillar to Bandura's work, and of course how that has been applied in criminal circles. And then fourth and finally, the idea that what we see in the world around us, the images, the symbols that are expressed to us that we learn through, in a sense, provide really the basis for most, if not all, of our actions and how we come to realize what the appropriate action is for a given circumstance or time. Now, as I said, control theory provides kind of a second major framework for Elliott's integrative model. And in control theory, again, we're taking a look at how, in a sense, individuals choose to obey the law, right? And the functionality of the law in our everyday lives. And it's in the area of control that we see Eliot then integrating strain, because strain theory is another very important topic and um, one that is part of that hierarchy of development. We're looking at the nature of strain and then how people are reacting to that strain, and then what ultimately the environment um, considers when it understands strain. And what I mean by the environment is, I mean, in this case, criminal law, how we understand social controls and how we understand appropriate and inappropriate or deviant behaviors, and then how we codify laws around that. The writings of Albert Rees, Reiss, become important when we're looking at how control theory connects to what we are seeing in this integrative model. Rees is the individual who gives us a deeper understanding of personal control and how personal control, in a sense, relates to larger social controls. So the idea that there are internal mechanisms that the individual is tapping into as they deal with strain and stress. And then there are social controls. This is where kind of larger society-wide kinds of functional systems start to become part of the mix. This is where we see law also being a big part of this. And the idea here is that there is this almost communication between the internal controls, the personal controls that an individual has, and then the expectations of the society, i.e., the laws, um, and how we navigate those two realities as it relates to some sort of additional strain or external experience. There is one additional person that we can connect with Reese, which is Ivan Nye, who again is taking a look at control, NYE, and is looking at how, in this case, juveniles make decisions based upon their internal controls and then, of course, the groups and ultimately the society that they are part of. And he broke things down into kind of a three-part system. He recognized indirect control systems where an individual, in this case a juvenile, would choose to refrain from particular behavior because of things like a disappointment that may be highlighted in a parent's face or in a teacher's expression, or it might cause pain in the lives of other individuals. That's again a kind of an indirect system of control and one that is closer to the individual. There are kind of those internal control systems. This is the idea of feeling guilt for actions or having a consciousness when it comes to, or conscience when it comes to, why one shouldn't participate in a deviant act. And then, of course, there's the direct control, and Nye here is connecting with the idea of some sort of oh, a consequence, either a punishment from a parent or a teacher, or in the case of criminal law, in this case, a child being integrated into the criminal justice system because of this behavior that they have partaken in. So the idea here again is control. And when our behaviors as individuals start to connect to the society. So what Elliot is doing here is he's taking a look at and identifying specific kinds of variables almost in a story-like format. He's giving us an idea initially of social strain. This can be the result of a person's feelings of being incapable of achieving a particular goal that they've been socialized into understanding. They then turn to social bonds as they begin to tap into their understanding of what they should or shouldn't do, looking at the actions of others ultimately and what they choose to do, weighing the consequences. So we've moved from strain to learning, and that's where we find the social relationships and peer socialization occurring. And then finally, then the individual, after they have assessed all of that, makes an individual choice. And at that point, they are then weighing those controls. They're saying, okay, well, first of all, do I want to hurt another individual? Do I want that individual to suffer in maybe the way that I have, or that I have witnessed people to have suffered? No, or it doesn't matter to me, right? And then one begins to assess what the consequences of an act would be. Or in another way, and again, this is kind of a two-way street, and we saw this before as well, what if I choose not to act in a deviant way, or what if I choose not to participate whatsoever? Are there consequences there as well? And then finally, we have the codified system of control that the society establishes, and this is the framework within which the resulting behavior lives. And the society historically and culturally will look at a behavior and determine whether or not that is an appropriate behavior. If it is not, that conduct is seen as delinquent or deviant, and the individual will then experience that direct control that Nye gives us. If it is something that is seen as positive, it is rewarded in a sense, or it is sometimes ignored. And that is also, again, keeping an individual outside of that direct control system. So when we take a look at all of the different criminological theories that are important to the criminal justice system, we have to realize that these are ideal situations, they're ideal scenarios. When we're talking about deviant behavior, the parent source for many of the theories that we look at and integrate into our research is the discipline of sociology. And we realize that that discipline by its nature will put us pretty far away from real world actions, real world consequences, real world events. However, the theory is meant to do that. It's meant to keep us somewhat outside of that. Then we take on that theory, we integrate it with a variety of other theories that we feel are a good framework for what we are studying. And then we begin to look at what are the real world data sets, what are the real world variables that we can tap into to be able to test that theory, to test those ideas, and whether or not those are the assumptions that are at work in the kinds of behavioral trends that we are witnessing in the criminal justice system.